There is a passage in the Gospel of Luke that I have read many times without truly seeing it. Luke chapter 1, verse 8. While Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by Lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. 2 sentences: a lot, incense, an angel. And the text moves on as if those 2 sentences are self-explanatory. They are not. They conceal an entire world. What does his division was on duty mean? It means there were 24 rotating groups of priests called mishmarot who served in the temple in Jerusalem in weekly shifts throughout the year. Zechariah belonged to the 8th division, the course of Abijah. When his week arrived, he left his home somewhere in the Judean hill country and made the journey to Jerusalem. He would sleep inside the temple complex for 7 days, perform his duties, and return home. This rotation had been established since the time of King David. By the 1st century of the Common Era, it was a machine that had been running for centuries without interruption. A living institution connecting every serving priest to every priest who had come before him, back through generations too numerous to count. What does chosen by Lot mean? It means no one in the temple chose their own assignment. Every morning, before the sun rose, before the first sacrifice could be offered, the priests gathered in a chamber of hewn stone and ran a sacred lottery. 4 lotteries per day, in fact, as the tractate Tamid of the Mishnah records in meticulous detail. The lots determined who would clear the cold ash from the great altar, who would slaughter the morning lamb, who would carry the blood to the altar, and who, the rarest assignment of all, would enter the holy place itself to burn the incense on the golden altar inside. That last lottery was different from all the others. The Mishnah states it plainly. A priest who won the incense lottery could never enter that specific lottery again, once in a lifetime. Only. There were men who served in the temple for decades, rotating through Jerusalem year after year, season after season, performing every other task the priestly calendar required, and died without ever crossing that threshold. The lottery was structured this way deliberately. The privilege was too large to repeat. The temple itself, the whole complex Herod the Great, had been expanding since roughly 19 BCE. A platform covering approximately 144,000 square meters was not simply a place of worship. It was the only place in the universe, according to the theology that had shaped Judaism for centuries, where the presence of God dwelt in a specific, physical, locatable way. The Holy of Holies at its center was the point where heaven and earth were understood to touch. Everything else, the lotteries, the tamid, the incense, the treasury, the entire operational machine existed to maintain access to that point. So imagine what Zechariah felt when his name came out. He was not a young man. Luke describes him and his wife Elizabeth as advanced in years. He had served his division's rotation for decades, making the journey to Jerusalem twice each year, performing every other function the temple required of him, and never once been chosen for the incense. Until this morning, until this lottery, in a chamber of stone, in the dark before dawn, when the count landed on him and the officer announced his name, and the other priests around him fell quiet. But before we reach that moment inside the sanctuary, we need to enter the temple the way he did before the sun rises, in the cold dark before cockcrow, with the stone floor still carrying the chill of the night. Because what you are about to see is nothing like what you imagine, and understanding it will change how you read nearly every scene in the New Testament that takes place anywhere near this hill. The Mishnah says the supervising officer arrived around cockcrow, roughly 72 minutes before sunrise. In practical terms, that means the priests were waking between 2:30 and 3 in the morning, not at dawn, not at first light, in the deep, cold dark of a Jerusalem night, with the city still and the courts empty, and the fires on the altar the only visible light for miles. The sleeping quarters were in a room called the Beit Hamokt, the Chamber of the Hearth, a large, domed stone room with a fire burning at its center and stone benches running along the walls. The priests who held the temple keys slept with those keys tucked beneath them as pillows. a detail the Mishnah records without commentary, as if this is entirely natural, which by that point it was. Junior priests kept watch in rotations through the night, sleeping in their vestments, so they could move immediately when needed. The Mishnah notes dryly that a priest caught asleep at his post could expect the captain of the temple guard to set fire to his clothing as a warning. This was not metaphor. It was enforced policy. Before anything else could happen, before any lottery, before any approach to the altar, every priest had to immerse in a mikveh, a ritual bath. Not because they were physically dirty, because purity inside the temple was an operational requirement, with the same force as any procedural rule in a formal institution. The Mishnah designates a specific official, one of 15 administrators, listed by name, who managed temple operations to treat ailments of the bowels contracted by priests who stood barefoot on cold marble pavement throughout their morning shifts. The temple had a health officer. It needed one. The immersion pools, the mikvaot, have been excavated by archaeologists outside the southern entrance to the Temple Mount. Dozens of them, cut into the limestone bedrock, still visible today. The first act of every priest's morning was descending into cold water in the dark, then dressing in white linen vestments, then presenting himself to the officer. There were 24 priestly divisions, each served roughly twice a year. During the 3 great pilgrimage festivals, all 24 divisions served together because the volume of pilgrims and the volume of sacrifices demanded every available priest. On those weeks, the courts were dense with activity, from before dawn until after dark. The rest of the year, only the division assigned to that week was present. 7 days, twice a year. That was the frame of a priest's life in relation to this place. The first lottery took place in the chamber of hewn stone, a room that sat half inside the sacred precinct and half outside it, with doors opening both onto the temple court and onto the city beyond. The officer called the priests who had completed their immersion. They stood in a circle. Each man raised a finger, 1 or 2, and the officer called out a number and began counting around the circle from that number. Whoever the count landed on performed the first task of the day. The ash removal was the first task of every temple day without exception. The great outdoor altar of burnt offering rose at the center of the priestly court, a massive structure of stone and accumulated ash, roughly 15 meters wide and over 4 meters high, fed by fires that burned continuously through every night of every year. The Mishnah describes 3 distinct fires maintained on its surface simultaneously. One for the daily offerings, one to supply the coals for the incense altar inside the sanctuary, and one kept burning permanently as a standing fire. By morning, the previous night's burning had produced enormous quantities of ash. A priest climbed the ramp alone in the pre-dawn dark, carrying a silver shovel, cleared space for the morning fire, and descended. Only then could the sequence proceed. Every step had its prerequisites. Nothing was improvised. Nothing was ever skipped. Let us stand in the temple court for a moment and look north. The Antonia fortress occupied the northwest corner of the Temple Mount, built directly onto a rock outcrop roughly 23 meters high. Its southeastern tower, the tallest of 4, rose to approximately 21 meters above that. From up there, Roman soldiers could see the entirety of the temple courts below. Every sacrifice, every lottery, every procession of white-robed priests and chanting Levites, everything that happened in this sacred space happened under permanent architectural surveillance, not occasional, not incidental, structural. The historian Josephus, who knew both worlds intimately, stated it plainly. If the temple dominated the city, the Antonia dominated the temple. The occupants of that fort, he wrote, were the guards of all 3. The sacred machinery of Jewish worship ran continuously and openly beneath the gaze of Rome. There was no hour when this was not true. The high priest's ceremonial vestments make the arrangement concrete. The magnificent robes of the high priestly office, the ephod, the breastpiece, the blue robe with its golden bells, the turban, the golden plate inscribed with the divine name were not stored in the temple treasury. They were held in the Antonia fortress by the Romans, released to the high priest on Passover on Yom Kippur, on the great festivals, and returned to Roman custody when the festival ended. One of the 15 temple administrators was specifically designated to receive the vestments from Roman hands and return them. A formal protocol, a named official, a line in the institutional record. The meaning required no explanation for anyone living under it. Even the sacred is supervised. Now, let us follow the second and third lotteries, because this is where the mourning accelerates into something after the ash removal. A second lottery assembled the working team for the slaughter of the morning tamid, the daily burnt offering. The tamid was the fixed point around which the entire temple calendar organized itself. It was offered every morning without exception on ordinary weekdays, on Sabbaths, on festival days. The Mishnah records that it was never skipped. Its regularity was itself a theological statement. The covenant between God and Israel was not a seasonal arrangement or a festival observance. It was a daily act, renewed before sunrise, every morning of the year. The lamb had been inspected the previous evening and kept overnight. Now it was brought into the court and given water to drink from a gold cup, a detail that tells you something about the deliberateness with which every step was performed. It was then examined again by torchlight, because even after technical dawn, the inner courts remained dark enough to require them. The examination had to be thorough. A blemished animal could not be used. The standards were absolute. The slaughter took place north of the great altar, at rings embedded in the paving stones for exactly this purpose. 24 rings, one for each priestly division, layering symbolism into the physical infrastructure. The blood was caught in a gold bowl and applied to the altar corners in a pattern prescribed by Torah law. The carcass was skinned, the parts divided according to a fixed protocol, the limbs carried to the altar ramp and set aside. Nothing could proceed to the altar until the incense was burned first. Sequence mattered absolutely, and beneath the paving stones, a drainage system channeled the blood away toward the Kidron Valley to the east. The smell of the temple is the detail that every honest account eventually arrives at, and it deserves genuine attention. The temple did not smell of incense. Incense was burned inside the sanctuary building itself, behind closed doors, by a single priest working alone in a room no one else could enter during those minutes. What the outer courts smelled of was what they physically were, a working slaughter operation at significant scale. Blood from the altar drainage system, the heavy organic smell of large animals in the enclosures nearby, waiting their turn, the acrid, settling smoke of fire consuming fat and bone on the great outdoor altar, not a delicate scent, but thick animal smoke that the Mishnah says was visible from Jericho on clear mornings. 25 kilometers away, a plume rising above the hill of Jerusalem before sunrise. This is not incidental color. It is what the sacrificial system was. In physical, operational terms, a high-volume slaughter and combustion facility running daily, scaling dramatically during the 3 pilgrimage festivals when the city's population multiplied beyond any ordinary capacity. Archaeological excavations outside the ancient city walls discovered a dump from the late Second Temple period containing an extraordinary concentration of animal bones, consistent with a city whose economy was organized around sacrifice at massive scale. The bone record confirms what the textual sources describe. Josephus writes of the city overwhelmed by pilgrims at Passover. Some ancient texts record figures for single festival days that modern historians treat with appropriate caution. The numbers are large, but the physical infrastructure of drainage channels, animal enclosures, and the altar itself confirms a scale far beyond what the word worship typically calls to mind. The money this generated was not incidental to the temple's function. It was the structural foundation of the city's economy. Every Jewish male over 20 throughout the Roman Empire, from Rome to Alexandria to Babylon to the communities of Asia Minor, owed an annual temple tax of half a shekel, not in Roman currency, whose coins bore the emperor's image and created theological complications for the treasury. The tax required Tyrian shekels, a silver coin of reliably high purity, minted by a pagan city, but accepted by temple authorities for its consistent silver content. Half a Tyrian shekel represented roughly 2 days' wages for an ordinary laborer. Since virtually no pilgrim arrived in Jerusalem carrying Tyrian shekels, the money changers were not optional. They were necessary infrastructure. Their surcharge, scholars estimate, approximately 8% above face value, generated enormous revenue across hundreds of thousands of annual transactions. Scholars working from Josephus and estimates of the diaspora Jewish population place the temple's annual silver income in figures equivalent, conservatively, to hundreds of millions of modern dollars. That revenue accumulated over 4 centuries. The temple treasury was one of the great financial reserves of the ancient Near East. Roman generals noted it and planned around it long before 70 CE. When Jesus overturned the tables during Passover, he was not disrupting an informal market that had grown disordered. He was confronting the financial infrastructure of the most powerful institution in Judea, the operational backbone of a system connecting every Jewish community in the known world to this one building on this one hill. Now we come to the third lottery, the incense. This is where the mourning becomes something the priests who experienced it could not fully account for afterward. The Mishnah records the formula exactly. The officer addressed the assembled priests. Those who have never offered the incense come and draw lots. Not all priests, specifically those who had never done it, because this lottery conferred a privilege granted only once per lifetime. A man who had already burned incense was permanently excluded from the pool. You could not win this lottery twice. You could spend decades in proximity to it, eligible year after year, and never be chosen. But once the count landed on you, you stepped out of this particular circle forever. The practical consequence: every morning, some priests were eligible and some were not. Senior men who had served for years, who had slaughtered hundreds of tamid lambs, who had cleared altar ash in every season, who knew the temple court the way a craftsman knows his workshop, stood aside and watched while the count went around among those who had never entered that room. There is something about that image that does not leave you easily. The men who know most, watching, the lot falling where it falls. Think about what this meant over a priestly career. A man could serve his rotation for decades, perform every function the temple required, and reach old age, having done everything except this one thing. Whether it happened to him depended entirely on a count, on a number called out by an officer in a stone room before dawn. Most priests never got there. That is what the mathematics of the system produces across 24 divisions, twice-yearly rotations, and a once-per-lifetime exclusion rule applied to a large priestly population. The man who won took 2 vessels, a golden shovel of live coals from the outer altar, and a golden container of prepared incense, a specific blend of 11 components whose exact formula is preserved in the Talmud, including frankincense, myrrh, cassia, and several ingredients whose precise identification scholars still debate. He walked through the great doors of the Haikal. Inside, the 7-branched golden menorah burning on the south side, its light the only illumination in a room built without windows. The table of showbread on the north, 12 loaves of fine wheat flour, replaced each Sabbath, eaten only by priests. And directly ahead, before the great woven curtain that separated this room from the Holy of Holies beyond it, the altar of incense, overlaid with gold, roughly half a meter square, burning. He placed the coals on the altar, poured the incense. The smoke rose, filling the room, thick and aromatic, drifting toward the curtain, and he prostrated himself on the floor and left. The entire act took perhaps 3 minutes inside the sanctuary, 3 minutes for which a man might wait his entire priestly career. When Zechariah won this lottery and entered, Luke says an angel appeared beside the altar of incense. Zechariah was terrified. The Greek word Luke uses is strong, closer to the shock of encountering something entirely outside the category of what you had prepared yourself for. He had spent decades preparing to enter this room. He knew its dimensions, its contents, its protocol. He had not prepared for what was actually in it. Outside, the crowd waited. When the priest entered the sanctuary, worshippers gathered in the outer courts understood what was happening. They followed the choreography of trumpet blasts and emerging smoke from the sanctuary doors even without seeing inside. When Zechariah did not emerge on schedule, they understood that something had not gone according to the protocol they all knew by heart. By mid-morning, the tamid was complete. The limbs were on the altar fire. The wine libation had been poured through the silver funnel at the altar's corner, running down into the channels below. The Levitical choir on the steps of the Nicanor gate had sung the psalm of the day. Each day of the week had its own, assigned since the time of the first temple. On Sunday, Psalm 24. On Monday, Psalm 48. The silver trumpets had marked every transition. The whole sequence had unfolded with the precision of a coordinated operation across hundreds of people, because that is exactly what it was. Every morning, every day of the year, the priest who had burned the incense emerged from the sanctuary and rejoined the others. The morning service was drawing. He would not be eligible for the incense lottery again. Every morning for the rest of his service he would stand aside while the count went around without him. What had happened in that room was his alone. Now it was permanent. And then in 70 CE, it all stopped. The Roman general Titus breached the Antonia fortress first. His troops came down through the connecting porticos into the temple courts. The fighting moved inward. The great altar was still burning. It had burned continuously for centuries without interruption when the sanctuary building caught fire. Josephus, who was present with the Roman forces, who had tried and failed to persuade the Jewish defenders to surrender and spare the city, describes what he saw in language that has not aged across 2,000 years. The temple burned on the 9th day of the month of Av. Jewish tradition holds this is the same date on which the first temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians, 6 centuries before. What ended was not a building. What ended was the entire operational system we have been walking through the lotteries. The tamid, the incense, the daily psalms of the Levitical choir, the rotation of the 24 divisions, the treasury chambers, the drainage beneath the stones, the fire that never went out. All of it in a single summer, gone. The priests scattered into the Galilee. Stone inscriptions discovered in the 20th century list the 24 divisions and the villages where each one resettled after 70 CE. They maintained the records. Every Sabbath in those synagogues, the Mishnah tells us, the priestly divisions were recalled by name, not as memory, as expectation, a roster preserved for a temple they believed would be rebuilt. There is one more thing to hold before we leave this place. Jesus walked in these courts, not as a pilgrim observing from a distance, but as someone who understood the system in its full operational, financial, and theological depth, the tamid and what it meant, the treasury and what it held, the money changers, and what their exchange rate represented. He told his disciples the temple would be destroyed, not one stone on another. Standing amid Herodian limestone blocks that weighed hundreds of tons, he said, not one stone on another. His disciples could not hold the thought, and he told them his body was the new temple, not a replacement structure, not a better version of the same institution, a relocation of the point where heaven and earth touched, which Jewish theology had located with great precision on this specific hill, behind this specific curtain, no longer a place on a map, a person. That claim only carries its full weight if you understand what he was standing in, not the postcard, the machine. The blood and the fire and the lotteries before dawn, and one man, once in his life if he was fortunate, walking alone through those great doors with coals and incense into a room full of smoke and silence to do the thing he had waited decades to do. If Zechariah's terror makes more sense now, if the overturned tables feel heavier, if the torn curtain at the crucifixion lands differently, then we have been in the right place together. Leave your thought in the comments. I read every one.